We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Huh? What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to The Antidote. This is Jeremy Roth-Kushel.
And this is Greg McCarran.
Today we have a special guest, Whitney Webb, the intrepid journalist and one of the most seminal investigators of these years, who has been tracking some of the key stories down, including the deep background and historical context and political purpose of the Epstein network, not just Epstein himself, but of the background of the network, its transnational aspect. And then what we're going to focus on today is the work that she's been doing around the deep background of the COVID-19 pandemic, but what it actually looks like in terms of this feast of shady characters who are in the waters looking for all kinds of either economic, political outcomes that would be beneficial to them and to maybe the networks that they serve. So we're going to deal with that today. And in a very recent story, just in the last few days, that she's put out, where she publishes at the Last American Vagabond, and she also publishes at her own site, The Unlimited Hangout. It's titled "Head of the Hydra: The Rise of Robert Kadlec," and it's by Whitney Webb and Raul Diego. Subtitled "A Powerful Network of Political Operatives, a Global Vaccine Mafia, and Their Man in Washington." And so, Whitney, thank you so much for joining us on The Antidote this week.
Thanks. It's my pleasure.
So let's just dig into this, almost like a chronology of this character that you drill down on here, who has not been put foremost in people's mind as much as he should be. Robert Kadlec, who is now apparently in charge of the entire the health stockpile of the entire country, and has a very interesting background, to say the least. And so maybe we should just start with the present moment, where just in the last days, basically, an alleged whistleblower, Richard Bright, I think his name is, used the language of the potential for the darkest winter in a modern American history, I think is some of the phraseology that he used. Whitney, will you take us into this moment and then take us back through the history here?
Sure. So in recent years, since Trump came to office, he nominated Robert Kadlec to be Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at HHS. And for most of that time, until relatively recently, this so-called whistleblower, Rick Bright, was his deputy, ASPR, which is the abbreviation of this assistant secretary position. And Bright was also the head of BARDA, which for all intents and purposes is basically this like cash cow for big pharma that, is taxpayer money that goes ostensibly to developing biodefense and vaccines and therapeutics and what have you. And in recent months, Bright and Kadlec had a pretty big falling out based on who should receive, receive money from BARDA. And they, in my opinion, represent different factions of these, big pharma mafias, I guess you could say. And their connections to all of this biodefense stuff. But it's very interesting that Bright, in his testimony to Congress earlier this week, used the term, if we don't do what I outlined, because in his testimony, he also outlined what he and other quote unquote experts said needed to happen to combat coronavirus. He said if those things were not done, that it would be the darkest winter in modern U.S. history. And this, of course, is very significant because actually the term Dark Winter, or the name Dark Winter for Operation Dark Winter in June 2001, comes from a line in one of the fake news clips used in those exercises. It's the second one, where it's none other than Robert Kadlec who says it's going to be a dark winter for America because there's not enough vaccines to combat smallpox in this fictional scenario that Dark Winter explored about a smallpox bioweapons attack against the United States. So the fact that you have, Kadlec's former deputy is the one saying Darkest Winter, and years prior, before the anthrax attacks, it was Kadlec using the term Dark Winter. It's quite disconcerting, I would say, for sure, especially since Bright used the term Darkest Winter as opposed to Dark Winter. Definitely raised eyebrows for me and other people that have been reading my series on this case. But what's important to point out about Kadlec now is that aside from all the drama going on with Bright and all of that, is that he is in charge by virtue of his position and in charge of HHS's entire coronavirus response. And because of the coronavirus pandemic, which is considered, a national health emergency based on existing legislation, that Kadlec had a large hand in shaping HHS as the lead agency for coronavirus response. So Kadlec is really arguably one of the point people, if not the point man, for the entire government's coronavirus response. And any focus on his history and his connections has largely slipped under the radar this whole time.
Do you have an initial sense of the use of the reference of Darkest Winter by Bright and what the politics behind that is, or is it too early to tell?
Well, what's interesting is that Bright has a lot of connections through his past employers to groups tied into the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He used to work for PATH. And managed a Gates Foundation grant for PATH to develop vaccines in Vietnam. And he also used to work for Novavax, a vaccine company that recently got the largest grant ever from a group called CEPI, which is largely backed by the Gates Foundation. And for people that have been following some of the narratives that are being seeded right now, Bill Gates has said on several occasions, that what we're experiencing now is pandemic 1, and there's been a lot of talk about a second wave or pandemic 2. And actually, Bill Gates, a few months ago, when he was asked about Event 201, he played down Event 201, but actually ended up mentioning Dark Winter. So he's definitely aware of it. So the fact that you're having, Rick Bright essentially fearmonger that if we don't do this, and this, there's going to be, a second wave, pandemic 2, as it were, and then using the term Darkest Winter. There's some, it's speculative, of course, because we haven't gotten to that point yet. But, those are the sort of things that came across my mind when I was looking at, Bright's history and why he was saying this, and what he's accusing Kadlec of doing, because Kadlec wants to use a lot of the BARDA money and HHS money earmarked for coronavirus and send it to companies that are different than the ones aligned with CEPI and Novavax and a lot of the more Gates-backed initiatives like Moderna and the RNA and DNA vaccines. And Kadlec's more tied into groups like Emergent Biosolutions or Bioport, Bavarian Nordic, and some of the other, pharmaceutical companies that he's been tied in with during most of his career. And
I think that we should eventually, pardon the pun, drill down on the drills, the way that they, in these specific circumstances, often look like they're actually some kind of pre-scripting, or this idea of drills gone live. We tied one of our subtitles to one of our shows on coronavirus was something about deep state drills gone live. And the epicenter of Dark Winter as a drill is very, very interesting, not only because of the cast of characters, which includes, Judith Miller, maybe the key quote unquote journalist propagandist in the run up to the Iraq War, right, but also James Woolsey, a former CIA director, but also enmeshed in this sort of modern Trump network. And this was all being done in the run up to the September 11th false flag, which the anthrax attack itself, with the notes, which are so obviously done as a potential add-on false flag, where it's sort of childish handwriting that says basically 9/11/01, we have this anthrax, death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great, or something like that. And I think we should, continue to drill down on that, especially in terms of the timing of that, where you have the confluence of the real estate transfer transfers being done in relationship to quote unquote ground zero of September 11th being finalized from people like Louis Eisenberg at the head of the Port Authority, whose deputy was actually the eventual Trump deputy campaign manager, Michael Glassner, at the time, transferring it from the Port Authority into the private hands of Larry Silverstein. And then, of course, this question of Jerome Howard being there, in the background of ground zero, ultimately, both in terms of New York, Manhattan, World Trade Center 7, the emergency operations bunker built into World Trade Center 7, ultimately demolished on live television. And then also the key figure in the warnings, quote unquote, and prescripting of the eventual anthrax attack. So that timing is crucial. But I think what we should probably do is cast back into history, and you give us a background of this character, the head of the Hydra, as you call him, Kadlec, and then we'll move through a few eras here, and then get back into Dark Winter.
Right. Okay. So I guess a good place to start then is back where Robert Kadlec says he became a quote unquote accidental tourist in terms of his interest in biowarfare and biodefense. Robert Kadlec was originally a U.S. Air Force physician and flight surgeon, but on the eve of the Gulf War, he was assigned to be a special assistant to the head of Special Operations Command, General Wayne Downing. And this is significant because during that period, right immediately prior to the Gulf War, the decision was made to inoculate several thousand U.S. troops with anthrax vaccine. This was allegedly done because of the advice from a guy named William C. Patrick III, who was a consultant at the time, but a former Fort Detrick guy. And he was asked by the Pentagon as a consultant about the likelihood of, soldiers from the U.S., if they were to invade Iraq, if they would experience biological weapons attacks. And actually, I didn't include this in my report, but one of the reasons this vaccination program was put into place, according to reporting by Seymour Hersh done a few years later, was because this head of Special Operations Command at the time that was being advised by Kadlec actually had special forces go to Iraq before the invasion, kidnap Iraqi soldiers and forcibly take blood samples from them. And based on those blood samples, which Patrick apparently analyzed, he determined that they had immunity to anthrax. But, that doesn't necessarily mean there was anthrax being used as biological weapons or they'd been inoculated with anthrax vaccine, because in that, exposure to anthrax in parts of the world is actually very common through interaction with livestock or sheep and wool and things like that. So it's actually not that uncommon.
Which is also, by the way, one of the ways that post 9/11 that the threat, the hyping of the biological threat, especially post anthrax, was done in Midwest of the United States of America, about Al Qaeda in the crop dusters spraying, anthrax or stuff like that, because cattle farmers understand that what it is, that they have contact with that kind of thing. So.
Right. Well, the anthrax vaccine that was used to inoculate the U.S. troops was actually originally developed for U.S. farm workers in the Midwest. And that's why that facility that was eventually acquired by this company called Bioport, it's in Michigan. And that was originally developed for, Michigan, livestock herders and things like that. Right. So anyway, based on that analysis or that determination by Patrick, this anthrax vaccination program is done. And of course, years later, what is known today as Gulf War syndrome, these neurological issues and other issues that were experienced by a lot of Gulf War veterans was later linked to large amounts of squalene, I think it's pronounced, in the vaccine. But of course, this was kind of covered up because the task force set up by the Pentagon to investigate Gulf War syndrome was headed by this guy named Joshua Lederberg, who's very tied in with William Patrick III and some other Fort Detrick figures turned consultants. And actually, at the time of the investigation, Lederberg was on the board of the company that at the behest of Donald Rumsfeld and the Reagan administration, had shipped large quantities of anthrax to Iraq's Ministry of Education in the mid to late 1980s. So, that the fact that those shipments had taken place was also used as part of this basis for Patrick's reasoning that there could have been a biological weapons attack involving anthrax in Iraq, right? So, which it led to this vaccination program. So, that was obviously a conflict of interest. And Lederberg even admitted later that he didn't spend, a lot of time digging into the details of the Gulf War syndrome. And later the Government Accountability Office basically said the whole, task force investigation led by Lederberg was a farce. But anyway,
Whitney,
so years after.
Let me just add one really brief thing about this question of the Gulf War syndrome, the Gulf War I in some ways, and the cover-up of it, and because this is a crucial thing, because of course this deeper background of aspects of the U.S. government, the CIA in relationship to Saddam Hussein, the facilitation of his weapons programs, especially in relationship to attacking Iran, was a key piece of what they wanted to cover up. But what you've tracked down in relationship to this background of this anthrax vaccine, where American soldiers were basically used as guinea pigs at some level at the very best. There's another piece of this, that there has recently been a Black Ops whistleblower. His name is Cody Snodgrass, Snodgres, who claims that there was sort of like a binary aspect to the weaponization of what American soldiers were dealing with post-Gulf War. That one aspect of it was this immune attack of the anthrax vaccine, and then another piece of it was the introduction of depleted uranium munitions for the first serious time, where American soldiers were blowing up Iraqi tanks, and with big explosions and the micronization, the aerosolization of depleted uranium, and almost like you then get a binary weapon of what one piece is the injection, and then the other piece is this depleted uranium. And then the final piece of his testimony, Cody Snodgrass, is that the records of all of this, a massive cover-up, an intergenerational poisoning of genetics, really, if you think about it, not only in Iraq, but also in American military veterans, that a lot of those records that were going to, potentially liability in trillions of dollars, if not millions of affected lives for U.S. government, were housed in the Oklahoma City Murrah building.
That was the target of the bombings in 95. I think it's also worth pointing out that the governor of Oklahoma at that time, who just 3 months prior, I think had become governor before the bombings, he was a key figure in Dark Winter as well, which is worth pointing out. But actually his involvement is why the epicenter of the smallpox scenario in Dark Winter is in Oklahoma, because he plays the role of like governor of Oklahoma in Dark Winter. Wow. Pretty interesting, right? But anyway, going back to Gulf War stuff. So after the Gulf War, Patrick and Kadlec are weapons inspectors in 1994 looking for signs of a biological weapons program in Iraq. And of course, they don't find it. But Kadlec goes back twice more before the 2003 invasion of Iraq. He goes in 1996 and 1998 looking for biological weapons, never finds them. And then actually after the 2003 invasion of Iraq, he goes back twice more looking for the same thing and still never finds it, and has even admitted in congressional testimony that there was never any concrete or definitive evidence of Iraq ever having a biological weapons program, but he's sure it's there, right? He's sure it was there. They just covered it up, or something like that. But what's interesting is that during the same period of time also, after this initial weapons inspector visit in 94, Patrick and people like Patrick, Lederberg, and Jerome Hauer, and a guy named Thomas Monath, who was a top science advisor to CIA Director George Tenet, were involved in several closed-door meetings about the bioterror threat with Bill Clinton, and this was responsible for a lot of Clinton era policies later on in his second term, right, that revolved around biological weapons, preparing for WMDs, and several speeches that Clinton gave that sort of before Bush even took office, seeded the narrative of Saddam Hussein developing biological weapons and sort of setting up, the justification for what would follow later under the Bush administration in some sense. And a lot of that was guided directly by this group of people that would later have, an interesting connections to what happened with the anthrax attacks in 2001. And actually, it was a book, supposedly Bill Clinton's concern about biological weapons in particular was, just driven into overdrive by reading a novel called The Cobra Event, written by a guy named Richard Preston. And actually, it was William Patrick III that advised Preston about the horrific made-up fictional disease called brain pox that's involved in this novel that apparently scared the living hell out of Bill Clinton. And it was basically just some, scenario that this Patrick guy, who honestly, if you read the articles about this guy from the 90s, even in the New York Times or the New Yorker, I mean, he's honestly just totally out of his mind, obsessed with death and like these horrific scenarios. And people like Kadlec were also during this period of time writing these really extreme biowarfare scenarios with no basis in reality. And of course, Kadlec would go on to be involved in the writing of the Dark Winter scenario, as was Randy Larson, a close friend of Patrick and Kadlec, who actually hired Kadlec to teach at the National War College in the late 90s. And during that period of time, when after Kadlec joined the National War College, Randy Larson, who was friends with both of them, became director of Answers Institute for Homeland Studies or Homeland Security, or IHS. And that was founded at the behest of Answer CEO at the time, Dr. Ruth David, who was the CIA, former CIA top science and technology officer. And, Answer was a really key part of driving down this focus post 1997 on Homeland Security, and set up a lot of the framework that would later result in the creation of the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11. And it was actually some papers that Kadlec had written while at the National War College in early 2001 that talked about talked about a lot of things that would come to fruition after 9/11, including, the Department of Homeland Security, as well as, the expansion of the Strategic National Stockpile that he now controls exclusively based on his, current position at HHS, a position that he largely oversaw the creation of by drafting decades of biodefense legislation. And of course, this Answer Institute was involved, one of the sponsors of the Dark Winter exercise, along with the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, which was headed by Tara O'Toole, who now works for NQTEL at the CIA, and as well as Thomas Inglesby, who's now the director of that center and was the moderator of Event 201 last year. So, and then the other players in Dark Winter, another faction that is involved here is the group from the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which involves former Senator Sam Nunn, Ted Turner, the founder of CNN, and then people like Margaret Hamburg, whose father, David Hamburg, was very close friends with Joshua Lederberg in all of this. And so, this is just sort of the new generation, sort of a passing of the baton here by this period of time once Bush is in office, from people like Lederberg and Patrick, who had, developed the ideas behind these policies, and then moving it over to people like Kadlec and Randy Larson and Tara O'Toole, which are sort of the next generation of these, bioterror alarmist or biodefense policy makers.
What I'm getting out of this series, and I think this is something, my perspective and my take on this is not a one size fits all for like everybody who's like into, say, alternative media. But for me, and I would guess this is the case for a lot of people in our audience and probably also in your audience, Whitney, is that the biowarfare components of this have been just as crucial, just as important as the other predictive programming going on prior to September 11th, through things such as the, obviously everybody I think who's in alt media knows about the Project for a New American Century and the idea of a new Pearl Harbor, and the traditional propaganda, as far as traditional propaganda warfare, as far as the Iraqi threat, or the threat of coming from the Middle East of weapons of mass destruction, other things of that nature, of a physical terror threat, but this biological terror component has been equally as important all of this time. I'm just now beginning to really put this together, and it's fitting that it's through a crucial time like this that we've had people like you out there really getting down into the grind of things and really putting together this research in such a concise manner right now, because you look at this for going on for 3-4 decades now. The biological warfare propaganda has been just as prevalent in so many ways. And I was thinking of a couple of examples you were talking about in there. We all know about Project Lunar New American Century, the new Pearl Harbor, but you also write about you mentioned in your article that there was a article, I don't know if it was written by Kadlec or not, but certainly by somebody in this close-knit community of people involved in all these exercises. There was a biological new Pearl Harbor that was written about in May of 2001. In addition to, you mentioned some of Kadlec's imminent doomsday warnings. It very much reminds me of a combination of PNAC, but also of the writings of people like Philip Zelikow in the lead up to September 11th. Kadlec warning in 1998 of an imminent doomsday-style anthrax attack, which could kill hundreds of thousands. And one more thing, you brought up the anthrax and the agricultural component with crop dust and things of that nature. Kadlec, since the mid-90s, has been writing you mentioned these sensationalistic, not rooted in reality scenarios that Kadlec was putting out, always seem to have China at the center of these scenarios. For example, you quoted it as fictional biological economic warfare scenarios, and one of them involved China and crop dusters, which came up in as Jeremy was talking about with the anthrax. But you're seeing here a continuity, just like with the WMD propaganda or the propaganda, the rise of the terror narrative. Right as the public is also being conditioned to believe that Osama bin Laden is this master terrorist who opposes this imminent threat to America, you also have this biological warfare component going on now. And Kadlec and people like him, fellow travelers, run in this relatively close-knit groupings that include, you mentioned the Washington Times as the primary propaganda conduit for this type of information. Washington Times being very much tied in with the war on terror hardliners who have framed this as a civilizational conflict against Islam, and also the China hardliners through things like Steve Bannon and Frank Gaffney in the Committee on the Present Danger of China. You're seeing a continuity here where, you get the enemy, radical Islam, now it's China, but very much the biological component has been just as crucial all this time.
Right. Well, what I think is interesting about what you just brought up is that another reason why Robert Kadlec is very interesting right now is because last year he did, it was a 4-part, very massive simulation about a pandemic flu outbreak that goes global and originates from China called Crimson Contagion that began in January of last year and went all the way through to August, involved 19 different federal agencies, essentially the entire government, including parts of the military in the entire intelligence community, Secretary of the Treasury, Department of Energy, just a very far-reaching exercise. It also involved participation from 12 states and numerous private sector companies, including ones that Kadlec had previously consulted for, as well as companies that are on the short list to be part of this national contact tracing system being overseen by Jared Kushner right now. So it's very interesting that Kadlec was the lead creator and author of this scenario last year that was, eerily prescient about what would follow a few months later, not unlike Event 201, right? And especially considering that for years he wrote, back in the 90s, these scenarios about China being involved in biowarfare and biological weapons is interesting as well, as is the fact that actually, since he was involved in the writing of Dark Winter, if you actually read the official Dark Winter script that was used as part of the exercise in the beginning briefing that's given by Randy Larson to all the participants, one of the pieces of intelligence, I guess you could say, fake intelligence used for the exercise, right, talks about China introducing foot and mouth disease to Taiwan to corner the pork market. And this scenario had been written essentially verbatim by Kadlec in the 90s, but not with Taiwan and pork, but with the U.S. and corn, right? So it's just very interesting that the same narratives just keep popping up a time and again when these people do these drills in a way that is, as you point out, there's a lot of continuity between them even decades later.
Well, what's interesting, too, is that similarly the way that the justification, especially in the ramp-up, it looks like post 9/11, of these so-called biodefense installations, the level 4 labs, and it's always being done under the cover or under the pretext of this is biodefense, or even that this is meant to actually help the civilian sector in figuring out how to protect people from potentially naturally or attack scenario pathogens or contagions and things like that. But what it looks like is in a similar fashion to these drills where it's being done is how are we going to defend ourselves? For example, China's going to attack, with the corn conspiracy or whatever it may be. And then meanwhile, then it looks like China potentially was subject to an attack on a potential swine flu attack, which they actually had to kill large portions of their pigs, it looks like, other bird flus. And there's not definitive evidence that those were attacks, but it's very suspicious in relationship to the way that the drills are done, apparently in a defensive or a pretext of a defensive posture, just like these labs are set up as under the pretext of a defensive posture. And then things seem to go offensive and then live, and attack scenarios are going live. And one thing I just wanted to bring up, a data point. We won't be able to really digest it in this interview with you, because there's a whole other rich area that you've been working on, which includes the question of high technology, of some of these very murky questionable at best areas of DARPA research, brain technology, genetic DNA technology, but also the question of cyber technology and transfer, and this apparent merger in some ways of this, what you call a binational security state between the U.S. and Israel. And when you brought up In-Q-Tel, I remembered that Amit Yaron, who's this key character in the cyber aspect, it looks like to me, of the September 11th operation, in that he is in charge of the Pentagon's cyber strategy in the run-up to September 11th. Then he's in charge of Homeland Security cyber in the wake of September 11th. Then he's in charge of In-Q-Tel for a few months in around 2006.
Right.
And meanwhile, he and his brothers are fully integrated in what is obviously an Israeli military intelligence, high technology network about introducing probably backdoor technology into the U.S. Cyber sector. And yet he's at the helm of what are ostensibly some of these American government operations.
Right. Well, that's definitely interesting that you point that out. And I hope that we can go into that in another time, because there is a lot of interesting things even going on now with that, specifically like the company that I talked about in the series in January, Cyber Reason, is essentially, in my opinion, an Israeli military intelligence front company run by people from Unit 8200, and their CEO, who used to be a commander in Unit 8200 for offensive hacking operations, called his work at Cyber Reason a continuation of his service to Unit 8200. So that's about as open an admission as you can get. But they run antivirus software for a lot of the most secretive networks of the Pentagon and the intelligence community right now, and that is just, antivirus is widely regarded as, the ultimate backdoor. And given the history of, Unit 8200 in Israel in general, with companies like Converse Infosys, now Verint Systems, and Amdocs, among others, it's amazing that there hasn't been more attention given to the fact that that's the company with a very likely backdoor into some of the most sensitive systems in the U.S. And given what Cyber Reason predicted for Election Day this year, and what we're seeing also being predicted closer to the date, given the coronavirus crisis, about the fate of the 2020 election, definitely very interesting.
And before we let you get back into Dark Winter, I just wanted to point out one other thing that I dug up about timing of where people are right before these sort of horrible scenarios unfold. For example, Bernard Kerik, a key character in terms of the Jerome Hauer, Rudy Giuliani network surrounding September 11th, is in Israel, ostensibly in something around counterterrorism, basically in August of 2001. one. Giuliani is in Israel in something about cyber counterterrorism in the run-up to the so-called election of 2016. And then it looks like Robert Kadlec is hanging out in the Israeli Health Services Command structure sometime. It looks to me like August of last year of 2019.
Oh, fascinating.
Yes.
That was during the last Crimson Contagion exercise. So that is definitely an interesting tie-in for sure.
And I'll throw one more point in there regarding this whole Israeli connection, is that you had, it seems to me that a large portion of the propaganda coming out about this originating as a bioweapon out of Wuhan comes from Washington Times quoting a former Israeli intelligence, Danny Shoham via Bill Gertz, who has bragged on Steve Bannon's podcast about having Mossad contacts and Israeli intelligence contacts being some of the leading sources of his work, which then leads to this entire domino effect of people from Tom Cotton in the Senate all the way down coming out with this bioweapon narrative pushed really hard. It seems to have at least really being shaped by this Washington Times claim that Danny Shoham came out by saying that.
What's also interesting is that on Steve Bannon's new Pandemic War Room show, he often features Stephen Hatfill, who was one of the top suspects early on in the 2001 anthrax attack investigation and is actually the protege of William C. Patrick III, and their relationship was described as being like father and son. There's a lot of very odd things about Hatfill and Patrick, so it's very interesting that you would see, again, talking about continuity, someone like Stephen Hatfill be giving a platform to talk about pandemics and all of the stuff in the Wuhan narrative by Steve Bannon, who's tied in with this Committee on the Present Danger of China, which has a lot of, PNAC, tie-ins, I guess you could say, through like Gaffney, Frank Gaffney and James Woolsey, among others. And of course, this current incarnation of Committee on the Present Danger, because this is the fourth one about China, but the third one was about the war on terror and included people like Jerome Hauer on it, right? So it's just very, very interesting to see all these different aspects that remain, continuous from 2001 to now. I might as well just get into that now for the sake of of time, right? So as I mentioned earlier, so like Jerome Hauer, right, during this time was at the Office of Emergency Management of New York. And in that capacity, he was being advised by William C. Patrick III, and Hauer and Letterberg and these other guys were having these meetings with Clinton, right? And beginning in 1997, the Pentagon began financing or approved a covert project regarding the development of a more potent strain of anthrax through genetic modification of anthrax that was given to Battelle Memorial Institute. And a guy named Ken Alibek, a former Soviet defector that had actually been vetted originally by William C. Patrick III and was very close friends with him, was the program manager for Battelle for that particular program. And William C. Patrick III and Ken Alibek did a joint interview that was published in the New Yorker in 1998, and they talked about collaborating on a project involving anthrax. And at that time, Patrick was a consultant to Battelle. Right. And then a few years later in 2000, while this project is still ongoing, Battelle signs a contract with Bioport, which is in part 2 of my series and is now known as Emergent Biosolutions. And Battelle was involved in attempting to help Bioport regain its ability to produce the controversial anthrax vaccine. And in August 2001, Bioport was set to lose that contract entirely. And of course, the events of the 2001 anthrax attacks that would follow later reversed that issue considerably, to the great, fortune of Bioport, right? Beyond that, at the same period of time that William C. Patrick III was involved in that type of activity, he was also a consultant for SAIC, and through his connections there, got his protege, Stephen Hatfill, a job at SAIC. And a year after Hatfill was hired, Jerome Hauer becomes a vice president of that company. and then later, is still vice president there when he becomes managing director of Kroll Inc., among other very strategic and convenient roles for Howard to be involved in at this period of time, right? And at SAIC, Hatfield commissions Patrick to perform a study that involves a fictional terrorist scenario where an envelope is opened in an office and the envelope contains weapons-grade anthrax. And that study talks about exactly how much anthrax, how many grams you would have to put in a standard business envelope to conduct that attack. It talks about how anthrax would spread through mail rooms and spread through the air, and a lot of other things that were, essentially repeated with the 2001 anthrax attacks. And it's worth pointing out that after the anthrax attacks happened, William Patrick and Ken Allebeck were both initial suspects, but after passing a quote unquote polygraph test, William Patrick, who was not just a consultant to SAIC and Battelle, but also the FBI and the CIA and the Pentagon, among other things, right, is actually, after passing this polygraph test, added to the top technical advisors of the FBI's investigation into the anthrax attacks. And it's later determined that the source of the anthrax could only have come from either Fort Detrick or Battelle, but the Battelle tie is essentially covered up and ends up creating a lot of infighting within the Department of Justice itself, to the extent that attorneys of the DOJ speak out against their other people in the DOJ, saying, like, why are you ignoring Battelle and just focusing on Fort Detrick, especially regarding to the claim that Bruce Ivins acted as a lone wolf, and that the source of the anthrax attacks was from Fort Detrick specifically, when, there's a lot of indications that instead actually had come from Battelle. So, Hatfield was a prime suspect in the beginning, and was eventually exonerated. But a lot of the reasons he was considered a suspect was because of activities in which Patrick was also directly involved. But of course, by that time, Patrick had been cleared. And I'm curious if the polygraph test that Patrick had been administered was similar to those given to the 9/11 high-fivers or dancing Israelis, where they were allowed to take the polygraph multiple times until they passed, essentially. So I wonder if Patrick was given that same privilege and then added to, this inner circle of technical advisors in the investigation. But what's also interesting, too, is that immediately after 9/11 and before the anthrax attacks, it's actually Robert Kadlec who becomes an advisor to Paul Wolfowitz and Donald Rumsfeld directly on issues of biological weapons. And as I mentioned earlier, that Battelle program was a covert Pentagon program. And of course, Kadlec has ties to Patrick going back decades. And it's just very interesting, given all the other involvement of players of Dark Winter, like Jerome Hauer, among others, talking about how there's going to be a biological weapons attack, in the aftermath of 9/11. This includes Rumsfeld himself. And then after the attacks actually happened, those same programs at Battelle are reinstated. They had been paused in early September 2001 and then were reinstated while Kadlec was, advising that specific area of policy for the Pentagon. And also in this period of time when Kadlec's still advising the Pentagon is when Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz developed these notes that were later released as part of a Freedom of Information Act request, where in November of 2001, they were developing, they wrote about different ways to initiate hostilities with Iraq, and it involves disputes over UN weapon inspections involving WMDs. It talks about focusing on WMDs, which is the precise thing that Kadlec was advising these guys about, and talks about the need to link Iraq to the 2001 anthrax attacks. And it was actually Kadlec that was tasked by Wolfowitz to try and do that specifically. Because Wolfowitz had also sent James Woolsey to, quote unquote, firm up evidence connecting Iraq to 9/11. But the whole claim that bentonite had been found in the anthrax, which was a false claim, by the way, and trying to tie that to Iraq's alleged biological weapons program, that was actually Kadlec in charge of trying to develop that claim, which is definitely very interesting. And then, after a couple of months, Kadlec leaves the Pentagon and is added to the Homeland Security Council, which advises the White House on issues of Homeland Security, and he was the director of biodefense at that council at the time.
As we're in our last 15 minutes here, are there any specific threads, Greg, that you want to make sure that we touch on here?
Well, I think it's very interesting what you were just breaking down, Whitney, with Kadlec's role as an advisor to advisor to Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld. It would be interesting to know, and I don't know if this is documented or not. It would be interesting to know if Kadlec was serving in a similar role with people who we know from OSP, Office of Special Plans, the Doug Feith, David Wormser contingent, who obviously very closely worked in a continuity in the same type of propaganda aspect in the post 9/11 era. Just a question I came up with for myself. But one thing I was thinking about with relation to, I think it's so important that you bring in this nuclear threat initiative, and you bring in kind of the democratic, more scientific oriented elite of like the Democratic Party element here with, and it is bipartisan with Republican Senator Richard Lugar in addition to Democratic Senator Sam Nunn. But I'm thinking about this in regards to the quote alternative media narrative, which is so centered around like Bill Gates as this be all end all boogeyman responsible for so many things. But it's interesting that none of this type of work is ever discussed or brought into the conversation here. But you're seeing here with this dark winter, Sam Nunn serving as the president of this whole dark winter exercise. I go back to thinking about the role of Ted Turner, for example, is right there in the Nuclear Threat Initiative as being a major proponent within the combination of environmentalism and also what we know is a population control style of operations going on globally. Yes.
Well, I think one thing that's really interesting about the Nuclear Threat Initiative is, their stated purpose is, counter-proliferation, non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and things like that. But it's actually its main focus, which was just totally kicked into overdrive after the anthrax attacks, was actually an idea long promoted by Joshua Lederberg, that involves offering former members of Soviet Russia's bioweapons program employment with U.S. companies, specifically U.S. pharmaceutical companies. And so a lot of what the Nuclear Threat Initiative spent money on was converting former Soviet Union bioweapons labs into research labs or vaccine production facilities for Western pharmaceutical companies, and basically bringing a lot of the guys like Ken Alabek, who had defected years prior, trying to find other people that had been in programs like that in the Soviet Union and bring them into the U.S. Fold, as it were. And some of those centers that have today maintained ties with the Nuclear Threat Initiatives are places like the Lugar Center, named for former Senator Lugar, who was part of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Like the Lugar Center in Georgia, which has actually, been investigated by, the blog Arms Watch. Dilyana Gonstadeva, I think is her last name, who maintained obtained a lot of documentation showing a lot of really shady activity going on there involving the U.S. government in that particular facility.
And
so it's very
to
interesting.
The country of Georgia, right? And these questions
not
about
the state. Sorry,
and that it apparent there's a lot of these investigations about how it looks to be an epicenter of potentially covert bio warfare operations in the region, potentially.
Right. And a lot of other centers besides the one in Georgia, the country of Georgia, right, that have been accused of that, all are sort of part of this network that was sort of developed in a lot of ways by the Nuclear Threat Initiative for this purpose, and are sort of now connected to either the U.S. government or, the DTRA of the Pentagon, or some of these other, government organizations, or with, a lot of these private big pharmaceutical companies that are also tied into this whole biodefense mafia domestically that people like Kadlec represent. So it's just a very interesting different side of it, because you have, the Homeland Security neocon type figures connected to the CIA through Answer coming together with the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And those are essentially the main sponsors of Dark Winter in a nutshell. So it's definitely interesting for sure.
Yeah. And I guess I would finish that point by saying that for people who are so like into these combination of environmental interests or faux environmental interests, might call them, combined with global depopulation, third world vaccinations or whatever. They need to put this into their research rather than listening to just this borderline incoherent, impossible to take serious narrative of Bill Gates, this cartoonish boogeyman that's just trying to kill everybody in some type of deep state globalist plot against Trump. No, there's a lot of strange bedfellows continuity going on here where varying interests might not quite come together in every single way, but there's
totally
at the top levels of both of these experiments. But it does not seem to be one discussed by so many in the quote alt media, because then it implicates you can't just paint this as just like the liberal deep state conspiracy. It's much bigger than that.
Right. Well, what's really interesting to me is that a lot of the people that have tried to investigate Bill Gates for, as part of that narrative you're describing have, greatly overlooked the ties of Bill Gates to Jeffrey Epstein, for example. And also the fact that someone like Margaret Hamburg, who was a key official in the Nuclear Threat Initiative, is still part of that organization, was at Dark Winter, was FDA commissioner under Obama, was also hit with a RICO lawsuit and is just fabulously corrupt. And her father has ties to used to run the Carnegie Corporation, very close to Joshua Lederberg and all of this group. She's now an advisor to the Gates Foundation. Why not focus on someone like that? Or the fact that Boris Nikolic, the former science advisor to Bill Gates, who's very close to him and involved with a lot of these gene editing for medicine companies that have been started up, by him and Bill Gates, was the backup executor for Epstein's will. A lot of that stuff has been totally absent. So I think a lot of the investigations into Bill Gates are just sort of focused on this, Alex Jones type conspiracy where it's like it's all about the UN and the UN, wants to take everything down. And, that's very convenient for states like Israel that also don't like the UN, and definitely leaves out a lot of very important connections.
Yeah. And they never mentioned Nathan Myhrvold, who was instrumental in the in cultivating and building Microsoft's relationship with Israel, who Alan Dershowitz has actually claimed that Virginia Roberts Giuffre mixed him up with and was actually identifying Nathan Myhrvold. So there's a lot of things I don't discuss.
And Myhrvold was the chief technology officer of Microsoft, I believe, somewhere around the turn of the millennium, surrounding September 11th. And yes, he was a key figure who introduced apparently Bill Gates into the radical benefit of investing heavily in Israeli technology companies, and once again, Epstein network front and center there. So as we're in our last 5 minutes here, Whitney Webb, we obviously would very much appreciate a follow-up with you on these sort of key areas of the network of high technology and Epstein and technology transfer and the binational security apparatus, as you've called it, between U.S. and Israel. But are there any key points about our current moment that your investigations have uncovered and are heading towards that you want to let us know about in these last minutes?
Well, there's a couple of things related to this article that we've been talking about Robert Kadlec that, I only really went into the timeline to to 2002, right? So really quickly, I'd like to sort of summarize the last part of that because it's not that hard to summarize it pretty briefly. But basically, after he left the Homeland Security Council, he was in numerous other positions where he was essentially drafting the legislation that ultimately created the position that he now holds at HHS. And he, of course, claims this is all a coincidence. But if you look at his career, it was very clearly guided by other interests, especially people related to the Potomac Institute, whether it's Yonah Alexander or Tevi Troy or some of these other figures that have guided him along. But what's interesting is that the office, it wasn't just Kadlec that was responsible for doing that. And this time, the other key figure was actually Jerome Hauer, who, among other things, on the day of 9/11 was National Security Advisor to Tommy Thompson and got the precursor to the Assistant Secretary of Preparedness and Response position that Kadlec now holds, essentially had that created and signed into law and ended up filling that position in early 2002 and was really involved in getting Bioport, this same company, tied into the anthrax vaccine in Battelle, among other things, getting their anthrax vaccine, essentially reinstated despite the safety studies. And even though U.S. veterans successfully sued the U.S. government to get the anthrax vaccine mandate stopped, Howard continued to heavily promote it and push it through, and then was later added to Emergent Biosolutions board. And Kadlec also has several ties to Emergent Biosolutions through the private sector. He co-founded a company called East West Protection with the founder of Bioport Emergent Biosolutions, a guy named Fuad El-Hibri. And ended up lobbying for Emergent Biosolutions and a lot of other things and a lot of these shady companies. But it's worth pointing out too that he has a lot of Kadlec in his years since has a lot of ties to intelligence related companies as a consultant to a lot of NSA contractors, also DARPA contractors and things like that. And since he's been at HHS in this ASPR position, he has really brought ASPR and DARPA incredibly close, and they're actually co-funding a lot of these, creepy DARPA initiatives related to COVID-19 solutions that I've talked about in prior reports are now being co-funded by Robert Kadlec's ASPR, including this new AppyJet contract for Operation Warp Speed and all of these syringes. That's just one of many examples of a Kadlec DARPA led an initiative in contract. And of course, Emergent Biosolutions and a lot of these other companies with really horrific track records in terms of safety are intimately involved in Emergent Biosolutions is involved in 3 different coronavirus vaccine candidates and a couple of these antibody treatments that are set to be approved before a vaccine. So it's definitely worth remembering their past with the 2001 anthrax attacks and the scandals that preceded that, in forming your perception of what they're likely to do now with coronavirus.
Well, in our last minute, will you let us know and our audience know where to find these articles, what articles to look for, and how to stay aware of your work?
Well, all my work right now is being published at The Last American Vagabond. You can find it at thelastamericanvagabond.com. You can find all the links to my series, which is called Engineering Contagion. On the top bar, there's a bar that says Web series, like my last name, Webb, and you scroll down, it says Engineering Contagion, and all those articles are there if you just want to find those articles specifically. You can follow my work by following me on Twitter at _Whitney Webb. I'm also on both Gab and Mastodon, which are Twitter alternatives, with the username Whitney Webb. I also have a Patreon that I'm going to be using to finance the time I'm going to be taking off next month to write my book on Jeffrey Epstein.
Well, thank you so much for all of your time and work out there, and we will put in links to your work in our show notes. Thank you so much, Whitney Webb.
Thank you.
Thank you.